Okay, here we are for Chapter 7, Lecture 2. In Lecture 1, we talked about encoding and storage. In this lecture, we'll talk about many different aspects of retrieval. So, first concept, we're just going to talk about a few concepts generally right now, and then we'll get a little deeper into the specifics of retrieval, or more importantly, the specifics of forgetting. So, tip of the tongue phenomenon. Everybody knows what this is. You've seen me experience it doing lectures where I know the words right on the tip of my tongue, but it's not there. Well, what's happening in that moment is the right side of your brain sees the image of it that's been shot across your right hemisphere, across the corpus callosum, over to your Wernicke's area, which is where all your words are stored. And then it's supposed to pop that up and give it to the Broca's area that permits that word to then come out of your mouth through all the motor function. Well, it gets stuck in the Wernicke's area because it can't find the word. That's tip of the tongue phenomenon. Another concept I want you to be familiar with is context and state-dependent memory. Now, state-dependent memory is actually a subset of context-dependent memory. The idea being that if you are back in the context that you were in when you first put something into memory, it makes it easier for you to remember what it was that you put into memory if you're back in that same context. So if we were doing a simple study on this, I would take the whole class, divide it in half, have half of you study in a classroom, a specific classroom, and the other half just study wherever you want for a test. And then give everybody of course, everybody's going to need to study for the same amount of time, and then everyone has the exact same amount of time to take the test. The people who studied in the classroom and took the test in the classroom then would get a better score than people who studied elsewhere and then came to the same classroom to take the test, because you were in that classroom when you were putting all that information into your memory. That is context-dependent memory. Another example of that would be, well, it just happened to me this weekend. I was fixing something upstairs and went downstairs to grab a tool that I needed to work on whatever it was I was fixing. And I stood there in front of the tool wall, looked at it, and I had nothing. Well, I went back upstairs, went to working again, came right back to me because I was in the context that I was in when I decided that I needed that tool. So again, context-dependent memory. Now, state-dependent memory is a little different. This is about emotional or even physiological states, potentially altered states of consciousness that a person might be in. And that individual will remember what they forgot if they enter that same state again. So I'm not promoting it, but people who are out drinking and the next day can't remember what it is that they did the night before, don't ask your friends for pictures or videos. Literally, all you have to do is drink a bit, and you'll remember what it was you did the night before. So, context, state-dependent memory. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Hermann Ebbinghaus. Hermann Ebbinghaus was the first scientist, psychologist, who applied the scientific method to the study of memory / forgetting. He came up with forgetting curves. In your book, there's a really good image I don't remember what page it's on, but it's where it talks about Ebbinghaus, and it shows what forgetting curves look like. How much information we forget over the course of time. The majority of the information we forget within the first hour since we were exposed to it. We're down to about 50%. And then as a day and more goes by, it gets down to about 30%. So about a third of what we see and focus on, if we're not extremely insistent on it, we'll only remember about a third, and that's at best. Now, Ebbinghaus came up with 3 concepts. These were retention, recall, and recognition. Retention, he said, was the proportion or the percentage of information remembered. And he talked about there being 2 different types of retention. And this is recall and recognition. Recall is bringing up information that you've memorized without any cues, simply having to bring it up out of nowhere. Whereas recognition means that you're given cues, like a multiple choice test would be an example of recognition, where you have the correct answer in front of you on the test, and therefore you only need to process it to a certain level. If it's a recall test, that would be an essay test, where you have to pull all of the information up out of nowhere. So a recall test would be an essay test. A recognition test would be a multiple choice test. There are a lot of theories of forgetting. We're going to talk about 4 of them. The first is ineffective encoding. This is very, very simple. It simply means that information in memory, to get into memory, must be accurately encoded. So if there's a lack of attention, or if there's a problem with the processing, like with certain learning disabilities like dyslexia or dyscalculia, the information is going to be encoded incorrectly. Therefore, it's going to come out incorrectly. So good encoding has to occur for good storage and retrieval to occur also. The decay theory is the if you don't use it, you're going to lose it theory. So this is the idea that information that you have learned and put away over an extended period of time, if it's not used, if it's not focused upon, it's going to fall apart. The idea is it literally decays. It just, it's kind of like it erodes. Now, this is not literally, it's figuratively. But nonetheless, it just fades away. Now, we also know, even though we accept the decay theory, if information has been learned once and it has decayed, it is still easier to learn it the second time around, because apparently there still are traces remaining. The third forgetting theory is called the interference theory. This means that information gets in the way of what you're trying to remember. There are 2 types of interference: proactive interference and retroactive interference. The easy way to remember these 2 is that pro means first, so You're trying to remember something new. Retro means old. You're trying to remember something old. And the opposite gets in the way. So proactive interference says you're trying to remember something you've learned recently and something old that is similar to the new information is getting in the way. So if you have a new address and you're having a tough time remembering the new address because the old address keeps popping into your head, that's proactive interference, trying to remember new, old getting in the way. Or let's say in high school you took German and in college you're taking Spanish. You're trying to remember the word for table in Spanish, your new language you're trying to learn, and all you can think of is the old word for table in German. Those would be examples of proactive interference. And retroactive interference is the exact opposite. You're trying to remember your old address and your new address keeps popping into your head. Or you're trying to remember a German word from high school, but the new Spanish word keeps popping into your head. And then finally, there's motivated forgetting. Now, motivated forgetting, your book seems to confuse the concept of motivated forgetting with repression. Now, actually, motivated forgetting is the larger concept, and repression is just one type of motivated forgetting. In the case of repression, it is that the unconscious is motivated to put away and or forget, not completely forgotten, but put away into the unconscious mind that traumatic information. Remember, repression doesn't occur because somebody had a bad day at school. Repression occurs from severe abuse, combat, severe experience in a natural disaster, or something along those lines. That's trauma. Sometimes I see other clinicians diagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder for someone who has absolutely no good reason to be traumatized. Trauma has to be a very real thing. It can't just be somebody called you a bad name a few times. It's a pretty serious, severely distressing experience or set of experiences that a person goes through and truly affects their everyday functioning, understandably so. Your book talks quite a bit about the false memory syndrome, and this actually is a concern. 25 years ago, we used to use we used to use hypnosis to try to retrieve repressed memories. We've found that that is not a good idea, simply because an individual is in a highly suggestible state when they're under hypnosis. And so because of that, it is easy to plant memories or even cause a person to create a belief of a memory that isn't really there. We know we can do this. It's been done in research where false memories have been implanted into a person's mind while under hypnosis. And the person believes that they are true. You can show them proof that they were somewhere else and with someone else that same day, but they will swear to you that that's a true memory. And it has occurred with some therapists that have been very indiscriminate in their attempts to bring forward repressed memories. And you think about that, that can be very, very hurtful to someone. It's bad enough to go through trauma. It's twice as bad to have to try to sort your way through real memories and planted memories as part of the false memory syndrome. So we have to be very careful with that. Therefore, we don't use hypnosis and other altered states of consciousness to try to recover repressed memories. We use other techniques that are much more organic and natural, and they do work quite a bit better. But the concept of motivated forgetting is much more than just repression. There are lots of other examples, like I was interning at a hospital. A young man was riding his bike on a college campus. Someone turned in front of him in a car, and he had to get out of the way real fast. And so he turned and slammed into a curb and went head over heels from the curb onto the lawn. And everything would have been fine except for one of the sprinkler heads, and it actually used to be a metal sprinkler heads, had not collapsed, and so it was still sticking up out of the ground, and he whacked his forehead against it and got a big goose egg on the front of his head and brought him to the hospital, and it gave us interns a wonderful opportunity to do memory testing on him and all sorts of other stuff. Well, he seemed to remember most everything, but what he actually did was he forgot 2 people in his life. He seemed to remember everything else. Those 2 people were his mother and his fiancée. His mother and his fiancée hated each other, and he was caught in the middle in the conflict. And it really wasn't funny, but it actually was funny. The 2 of them were racing to the hospital to see who could get there the fastest, I think. And it was the mother who got there first, and she came bursting into the room. And, if you're in the hospital, if you've ever been in the hospital, people walk in, fiddle with something in the room, and then walk back out all the time. It's just something that happens in hospitals. Well, the mother burst in, and we were doing memory testing with the young man. And he paused, looked up, smiled at her and nodded, and then went back to his testing. It was very clear that he had no recognition of who she was. And she started crying and ran out of the room, and he didn't know what the heck was going on. And about 5 minutes later, his fiancée got there. She did the same thing, burst in, he looked up, smiled, nodded, and went back to work on the memory testing. He didn't remember either of them. Now, this was psychogenic amnesia, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But this is a type of forgetting that is emotionally based, but it's not repression. Now, he may have felt a little traumatized by his mother and fiancé being so unhappy with each other, but it truly wasn't what we call repression. The next day, he remembered. We were in the middle of testing again. That poor guy, he just kind of, all of a sudden, all of it just came back to him. And you could see it in his eyes. It was like Atlas and the world just landing on the poor guy's shoulders. He was released later that day, and they were recommended to have family therapy. So all I'm trying to say is there are other aspects of emotional, psychological forgetting that are not just repression. So repression is actually a subset of motivated forgetting, but generally the most commonly one referred to. Now let's talk a little bit about amnesia. What is amnesia? Amnesia is forgetting. And we forget in 2 different ways, either organically or psychologically. Now, psychological forgetting is also referred to as psychogenic forgetting or psychogenic amnesia. So forgetting because of emotional, psychological reasons. Okay? Now we've already talked about what a number of those types of forgetting are. And then there's organic amnesia. Organic simply means there's a physical cause. Now there can be many physical causes. One can be a smack to the head. Another could be degenerative brain disorders like Alzheimer's or Tay-Sachs or Huntington's chorea or Parkinson's. These are all diseases that affect the neurons in the brain and contribute to memory loss. Now that is all called dementia. The loss of memory due to a degenerative brain disorder causes dementia. And dementia is defined as the loss of cognitive faculties. So, loss of attention, concentration, memory, reasoning, judgment, abstract thought, etc. All of those cognitive functions that we expect people to be able to do, those are lost in dementia. Now, under organic amnesia, there are two types, anterograde and retrograde. Now, the anterior of something is to the front of it. The retro is to the back of it. And that's exactly what these two mean. Anterograde amnesia is the inability to create new memories following the onset of an illness or a car accident or whatever the case may be. Whatever the damage is, whether it's by an illness or some kind of accident, that damage to the brain, if it causes the individual to have difficulty making new memories, that is anterograde amnesia. Retrograde is the opposite. It's the loss of memories that occurred prior to the head trauma or prior to the onset of the degenerative brain syndrome. So, different types of amnesia. Again, psychogenic, organic, and under organic, anterograde, and retrograde. We believe that memory is physical tissue. That's our best guess from the information that we have, that a new memory is part of the creation of new neural tissue. So how do we know that? Well, we don't know it exactly because we haven't been able to sit there and take movies of tiny little pieces of neural tissue being created with the creation of new memories. Instead, what we do is extrapolate. So, let's extrapolate. Number one, what is neural tissue made of? Well, neural tissue is made up mostly of protein. When people are in high states of learning, what compound does the brain create a lot of? Well, when you're in high states of learning, like during this lecture, in high states of learning, the brain produces a high level of amino acids. What are amino acids the building blocks of? They are the building blocks of protein. So because of that, we believe that lots of amino acids are being produced in high states of learning to have access to them for the creation of protein or neural tissue. Now, How much can we say about a human based on lower species research? Not a whole lot, really. But there's an interesting piece of research that's very interesting, that explains this well. If you know what planaria are flat little worms with triangle-shaped heads. They're only little things, but you may have played around with some of them in high school biology classes. You can cut them in half, and one half will grow the back half will grow a front half, and the front half will grow a back half. So clearly they're not just like us. They do have a nervous system, but it's a very simple nervous system. It just has a number of strands of nuclei or neurons going down the length of their tiny little bodies. But one thing we know about them is they are photosensitive. They love light. They love light because they soak it up and it warms them up. So, some researchers did something really interesting. They got this big vat of water and they put half of it in shade and half of it in the light. And then in the shade, over in the far portion in the shade, they would put planaria in and let them squiggle. Now, they don't have eyes or anything. They just move around until they hit what they are glad they hit. Well, these planaria would squiggle, squiggle, squiggle until finally, with just by accident, they'd hit the light. And then they'd stop and they'd soak up the light. And they'd keep taking those same planaria and doing it over and over and over. And pretty soon those planaria went straight to the light. Well, apparently they'd learned. They had some memory. They got put in the vat here. They squiggled right over here to the light. They got much faster getting to the light. Then they took these learned planaria and they ground them up. I know, oh, gross. Well, these are worms. Come on. They ground up the worms and they fed them to one group of planaria, another group that had never done any of this stuff. And then they fed another group of planaria just the same protein content food. So they did that to each group. One ate their buddies who had learned how to go fast from dark to light, and the other group just got some protein. Then they took each planaria one at a time, put them at the same starting point, and measured the amount of time it took them to get to the light. Guess which group got to the light lots faster than the other group? The group that had eaten their buddies who had learned to go real fast. So their conclusion was that at some cellular level, neural information had been transferred from one planaria to another through consuming it. They don't have stomachs. They don't have hydrochloric acid in their stomachs like we do. All they do is when they eat something, they just assume it into their bodies. So, with all that information, we don't know for sure because nobody's ever been able to prove it, but we believe that new knowledge, new information is literally the creation of new neural tissue. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about long-term memory. These are memories that are stored away and we pull up out of long-term memory through the retrieval process. There are 4 major types of long-term memory: procedural, declarative, episodic, and semantic. So, what are they? Well, let's start with procedural memory. Procedural long-term memory is memory for a procedure. Now, what does that mean? Well, I could make you the best New York sub sandwich you ever had. Because at 14 years old, I had my first job, and my job was at a pizza and sub place on the East Coast. Right outside of Philly. So, I mean, if I have the makings, I can make it. It's hard to get all the makings, though. The rolls are made in special ovens that have been around for years and years. And it has to be a hard roll with a flexible back. so that you can cut the roll open, dig out some of the white, lay it down flat, and the back doesn't break. That's important. And then you cut it fresh at the time. You cut this special spiced beef on the slicer, and you put it down on one side of the bread, and then you get your provolone, and you cut delicious chunks of slices of provolone down the other side, and then you fill the middle. But you don't do it like they do around here. You don't reach into a bunch of cut up lettuce and go onto it. Nah, you grab romaine lettuce and you break it. Because when you break romaine lettuce, it tastes different than if you cut it. So you break it in. You break in lots of other stuff too, like sweet peppers, not this pepperoncini crap they have around here. You cut open the sweet pepper, you pull off the top, you dig out all the seeds, and you break in pieces, hand break in pieces of the sweet peppers. You put in dill pickles, you put in some sweet onions. You then cover all that with some big old beef tomatoes. And then you sprinkle. You sprinkle some sea salt, some hand ground pepper, some, what do you call it, the Italian spice. See, tip of the tongue phenomenon right there. Oregano. Some freshly ground oregano you put on there. You put on some virgin olive oil and some red wine vinegar. And then over the top, you take this specially cured ham, big old slices, and you put it over the top of the whole thing. And then you take the back of your knife and you tuck that ham in all around all the fillings. And then you slice it in half. And when you bite it, it doesn't go out the back end because you made it all nice and tight. It's a New York sub. That's procedural memory. I learned that a long time ago. Procedural memory, riding a bike. You know how you get on a bike and you haven't ridden one for a long time and you're a little shaky, but it doesn't take long at all before you're just zipping around just fine. That's all procedural memory. Driving, procedural memory, etc. Okay? Declarative memory. Declarative memory is rote memory, and rote is spelled R-O-T-E, meaning it's just memorization. You have no idea what it is that you're memorizing, you just memorize it. That's declarative memory, just information, but memorized. I was in college and took a world religions class, and I was given extra credit for knowing all the books of the Old Testament in order. I can still do it. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastics, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Jonas, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Zechariah, Haggai, Malachi. What good does it do me? None. If I want to find the book of Isaiah, I have to go through all of them and realize where Isaiah is. So, that's declarative memory. It's just rote memory. Next is episodic memory. Now, episodic memory is kind of like what we talked about much further back, flashbulb memory. But it's individual memories, not cultural iconic memories. So when you've had an episode, an experience, let's say you get together with your buddies, you haven't been together for a long time, and somebody says, hey, you remember when? And everybody, ha, 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 ha. Well, that's episodic memory. And isn't it interesting that so many people remember episodic memory differently? Even though you were all there at the same time, everybody has a little bit of a different memory of actually what happened. That's episodic memory. Episodic memory would be compared to eyewitness testimony. It's not always super accurate. In fact, it's pretty easy to find some pretty negative problems with episodic memory, with eyewitness testimony. And then the last of the 4 types of long-term memory is semantic memory. Semantic memory is memory that is based on the knowledge of what went on. This would be you're working on a problem for a long time, for weeks, and then all of a sudden the little light bulb dings above your head and you go, aha, I understand. Well, that doesn't matter when it happened, because with episodic memory, there are 2 aspects to it. It's personal experience, but it's also very temporally dated, meaning it's chronologically remembered. Semantic memory doesn't have anything to do with when you learned it. It doesn't have anything to do with that at all. It has to do with the fact that the information was of value. And therefore, that's why you remember it, so you understand the concept. Those are your 4 types of long-term memory. And finally, last thing I'd like us to talk about are mnemonic devices. Just try to spell the word mnemonic without looking at it. And it's not spelled like pneumonia. M-N-E-M-O-N-I-C. It's Greek. What is a mnemonic? A mnemonic is a trick, usually with the use of associations that helps us remember information well. Now, the first mnemonic that we know of is the method of loci, L-O-C-I. And L-O-C-I, yes, refers to location. This is a method that was coined by Cicero, the ancient Roman orator. He was a senator in the Roman Senate, and he learned to give the most incredible speeches. People were amazed at how much information he could remember. But the way he did it was a little memory trick. So he had a garden at his home. He would walk through his garden the night before he would give an oration. And what he would do is he would associate every concept that he needed to bring up in order with things that were along the path of his garden. So maybe there was a rose bush or a fern or a moss-covered rock or a dogwood or I have no idea what they were, but he would create an association with each thing along the path. Now that killed 2 birds with 1 stone. Because not only did he remember what he needed to remember, but in his mind he was in his garden, which was a relaxing place. And what assists with memory? Well, relaxation does. It's good to be relaxed in your memory. There are other mnemonic devices. How about acronyms? An acronym is a word that you make up using the first letter of each word of a list of things that you want to remember. How about ASVAB? Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, I think is what it is. NASA, CIA, FBI, IRS. And how many times have you gone into a test and created your own word because there were 7 things that you needed to remember, FlibNet or something like that. There are other methods. Narrative chaining. On old Olympic towering top, a Finn and German viewed a hawk. Well, on old Olympic, OOO, occipital, olfactory, and optic, 3 of the cranial nerves. German, glossopharyngeal, Finn, facial, etc. So it's a little ditty that you learn to remember the first letter of all the 13 cranial nerves. Again, there are many, many different methods of using associative techniques to be able to help you remember things. But that's what I wanted you to know. Now, good luck. Get done with chapter 7. I will be putting chapter 8 up relatively soon. So you know, chapter 8 and chapter 10, neither of them will have quizzes. They will only have a writing assignment and a discussion. So they will be shorter and condensed. They'll only take 1 week this week. And then we have 2 more weeks left in the quarter after that. And those 2 weeks will be chapters 14 and 15 in the book. So that'll be coming up soon, and then we'll get through those final 2 chapters. But remember, chapter 8 is about intelligence and cognitive processes. We're only going to cover the intelligence part. And then chapter 10 is about developmental psychology. And we will discuss a selected portion of that information. So again, you will not have quizzes for chapters 8 and 10, and there will only be 1 lecture for chapter 8 and 1 lecture for chapter 10. So good luck, and remember, your papers are due on Friday, the 12th of June. Good luck. We'll see you then.